Hey everyone, welcome to my quick recap of our discussion last week on how not to be in a cult. I'm just going to be pretty straightforward with this one. Maybe in the future I'll be able to provide a little more flourishing examples, but we began with a little bit of a wrestling with what defines a cult. An article by Holly Meyer of the Tennessean says a cult is a charismatic group held together by a shared commitment to a charismatic leader or ideology. It has a belief system that has the answers to all of life's questions or offers a special solution to be gained only by following the leader's rules. That definition really makes it sound like anybody could be a cult. Any group would be a cult. Any religion, certainly, under that would be a cult if you're saying, hey, this really is what solves the questions of life, or at least puts you on the right track to do that. Another group, or another gentleman, Glenn Davis, who's the Chi Alpha campus minister at Stanford University, he wrote a really great PDF on how to recognize a cult, and I'll try to post that for you as well. He says, calling a group a cult is a concise way of saying that it is an unhealthy group that promotes false doctrine. He writes, a cult is not merely a false religion. A cult is a false religion, which is also abusive. Cults lead people to make foolish choices with their relationships, with their money, and with their futures. They often cause massive pain to people involved with them and to those who love them. What I find interesting about Glenn's definition here is that he's really focusing on the negative dynamics of a community, and that really is what carries the connotation of a cult today, is that there's some sort of negative group dynamic towards the members involved. There's some sort of abuse, coercion, even just oppression of sorts happening. And this differentiates it a lot between what's maybe a good group to be a part of, what maybe, as a Christian, when we're talking about religious cults as a Christian, we might say, any wrong religion or belief is unhealthy to some extent. But we wouldn't really call all of them cults. They're just mainstream other religions. And, I think that'd be a good discussion in the future. How do we interact with people with other religions? But what this definition also calls into question is there's probably some sort of scale here of what's a normal, good, and maybe healthy, to use that term, group versus what's a group that is really not acting in good faith, even if they claim to be. Because, of course, a lot of people aren't going to come right out and say, hey, we're a cult, join us. That does remind me of a very funny Seinfeld episode where George hears that there's this group called the Merry Cleaners or something like that are really a cult, and he wants to be recruited by them, and they don't recruit him. and so maybe he didn't feel good enough to be recruited, which does say something actually about how these things work. There are really a lot of different kinds of cults. Some do center around religion or religious beliefs, theological beliefs. These we would kind of call theological cults. They're maybe a deviant form of Christianity, or a form of Christianity that deviates from classical Christianity. That's mainly in Christian circles what we're referring to when we talk about a cult. But there are also a lot of other cults to be aware of that maybe focus on or use very mundane things, such as self-improvement, intellectual improvement, physical improvement, philosophical growth, just being a better you, or even financial improvement as sort of the hook to get into a very unhealthy, controlling kind of community. In fact, some cults have revolved around things like hot yoga. I believe actually the one who founded that, there's a really interesting documentary on that basically was a cult in and of itself. Others just form around personality or a common goal. And those goals oftentimes revolve around politics, religion, survival, sometimes even sex or pleasure, giving yourself permission to be who you think you want to be. But sometimes, that's how they start, but that's not usually all of where they end. A lot of cults actually revolve around some sort of fear and doomsday. Cults are a fairly well-known group. There was the group that, thought when the comet was going to go by the Earth, the Hale-Bopp comet, that they were going to be somehow caught up and delivered from this mundane existence. Oh man, the name of that's just slipping my mind at the moment. So sometimes there's a motivating factor, and almost all the time, some level of fear comes into play, whether that's a fear for your eternity or a fear for this life, or even just a fear that you won't be able to be the kind of person you want to be in the world. So what people do when they start to classify something as a cult or not, and we're going to be a little bit careful by saying this group is, that group isn't, because there really is this scale, spectrum we like to use of what's a cult or not. These flags, if they're there in kind of a high level, are an indicator that they're sort of cult-like behavior. And with this cult-like behavior, the reality is almost any group can exhibit some of that. So we want to use this discussion not just as a, hey, look at them, they're bad, or hey, watch out for that group, though I think it is important to be wise. Almost all the letters in the New Testament warn about false teachers and false beliefs, and so it's important to be aware of what's dangerous out there for our own protection. But I believe it's also a discussion of how can we be the kind of church that Jesus has called us to be, and not fall into really the ways of this world, which are really coercive, driven by power, money, protection. These are the things that we're supposed to find in Christ and aren't supposed to be the main things that drive our life. So a lot of these are from the masterclass on what is a cult that's out there. I'm not really promoting that. I haven't gone through it all, but these are things they list that I find come in a lot of these common lists on what makes a cult. So authoritarian control. Cultism hinges on encouraging maximum dependency. People in the cult must feel incapable of living an individual life outside the norms of the group. This goes hand in hand with a kind of a worshipful or putting on a pedestal the group's authoritarian leader or leaders. This is something we're going to look at in one whole week on its own. I believe that'll be in a couple weeks. But the idea is that there's actually a lot of people that feel a lot of safety in very controlled environments, and cults often offer that. But this isn't always the thing that presents itself at the beginning. Sometimes the groups appear to be very open, but what you find is, especially leaving the group becomes very difficult, or there's sort of this psychological twist that goes into if you leave, bad things will happen, or if you leave, is there a threat behind that? Is it just you're not going to achieve your goals in life? And so there becomes this pressure that you may even agree to control yourself. And this is kind of an interesting dynamic, especially for those of us like myself who I'm motivated to be a follower of Jesus. I want to be that. And that motivation that I have, somebody could try to take and use in a twisted way. And that's oftentimes how the cults gain control. It's not that you don't want to achieve your goals, but they say, well, for you to do that, you need to do these steps, and you want accountability, right? And you want to get there, right? So I'm really not asking you to do things I want. I'm asking you to do things you want. But what you find is it really is what the leader wants, not what you want. And there's a lot of coercion that goes into this. Cults hold extreme beliefs. This is another big red flag. Something very dogmatic or extreme and that is not able to be questioned. Sometimes there can be some level of discussion, but you'll find like if you really are in doubt of those, it becomes an ultimatum, are you in or out? And again, that pressure of what you want to be in to achieve your goals. Oftentimes, these beliefs to the outside world will seem really strange. But while you're in the system, it's like, well, that just made sense. Most of the people that are in it, a whole new worldview is formed. There's isolation from society. As soon as new members join a cult, this again is from masterclass.com. As soon as new members join a cult, other adherents work hard to isolate them from family members and friends. This helps fulfill the mind control, the aspirations of the leader, and creates sort of a hive mind between new members and other members. This mind control can happen with a lot of even the language that happens within the group, the pressure to always do things with that group and nothing outside the group. The characterization of anybody who would pull you away from the group is inhibiting, the goals that you have, those kind of things. There's, and we already began to touch on this, there's almost always a charismatic leader. The Manson family cult, around Charles Manson. And a lot of times this is because the leader is presented as somebody who's got a really unique look on life, and you want to be like them, or you want to help them achieve their goals. And in doing so, that's where your goals are achieved. So some examples: Heaven's Gate, that was the one I was talking about earlier. Apologize for the dinging here. They were a group in 1998 that became convinced they understood the book of Revelation. But they interpreted that in a really strange way. By the way, some of these strange groups, and even, coming to recognize the group as a leader, drugs are often involved. And, we're going to talk about that actually tonight if you're from the publishing. In one of the sessions, we're going to talk about why would anybody even join a cult. Jehovah's Witnesses is more like a mainstream, but what most Christians would recognize as a cult, because they deny the deity of Christ, among other things. They consider themselves to be God's only people, and there's sort of this subtle threat, but also tight community that a lot good happens with, but a lot bad also pressurizes you to be involved. There's NXIVM, a personality/sex cult that promised through self-improvement classes that you would become the kind of person you would want to be. And it was adopted by many celebrities. This one actually popped on the scene not too long ago. But the deeper people got into it, the stranger it got, the more controlling it got. And ultimately their leader was arrested for sex trafficking charges, among other things. Some even think multi-level marketing companies such as LuLaRoe took on at least extreme cult-like personalities. The feeling that you were trapped in it, the feeling that you couldn't leave because your whole livelihood was tied up with it, the recruitment of family and friends and things like this. So Glenn Davis writes this: identifying a cult can be tricky because cults don't generally think of themselves as cults, but they recognize that others view them as cults, and therefore they try to hide or minimize aspects of the group that seem cult-like. I mean, none of us want to be cult-like, and yet the thing with the cults is they rely upon those tactics to gain and keep their members, to grow, which is also generally tied in with their financial prosperity and flourishing. And so, interestingly, sometimes even there's this dynamic created where I think the leaders end up believing their own hype, sometimes because of the success that they've had. So here's some more flags that Glenn gives. He says, one, if ex-members consistently describe it as a cult, that's a pretty big red flag. He does kind of nuance this by saying this isn't just, an angry post or somebody that was, upset on the internet in a forum saying that, because sometimes people do get angry and leave. But if this is a recurring pattern among almost everybody that gets out, describing it as them like escaping or getting out, that's a red flag. Something going on there. The group hides its external affiliations or beliefs, and sometimes their history, often changing names, headquarters locations, or even denying that they have a larger organization behind it all. Again, most religious organizations will post their beliefs either on their website or find it pretty well accessible. This is different than like a church that, like our church doesn't put Assemblies of God in our name. We're not trying to hide that, but it's really sort of the moving target. A lot of this is even a real fuzzy set of beliefs that change over time based on what the leader happens to be thinking. So those beliefs may not even be fixed, they may just be convenient. The group thinks of all other groups as inferior and not even Christian. We see this a lot. I've seen this even more in Topeka, Kansas. Big red flag if everybody else is like way less than us. Now, this is different. Obviously, churches think what they believe is right, or they wouldn't believe those things. But I love my Baptist brothers and sisters, my Reformed brothers and sisters. I think we get things wrong in our denomination as well. Most cults, there's more dogmatic, we've found it, we've found the truth. And it's actually inside there's a comfort to that clarity, but outside that's definitely, they're the ones, you think about the groups here in Topeka that Westboro, like everybody else is going to hell. You should join our little group. We're the only ones who have it right. That's a red flag for sure. The group has a special translation of the Bible that isn't for sale in the local Christian bookstore. They have their own Bible or their own translation because it says what they want it to say. Now, again, this is different than, we'll use a number of different translations to try to understand the Bible better. And you might have your preferred translation. But if your preferred translation is like considered incredibly problematic by the rest of Christendom, that's a red flag. Again, there's going to be differences in beliefs and theology. It's a little different. The group rejects Orthodox Christian doctrine. Oftentimes, and this is where the doctrine of the Trinity is a good safeguard. And your doctrine of Christology, who is Jesus, is also a very good safeguard. Now, it's not to say you couldn't have a group that believes Orthodox things, but is incredibly cult-like. I think that's, again, the danger as well. And one of the reasons why we're doing this talk is we don't want to be that. But we do want to be somebody who is right doctrinally as well. And oftentimes where there's twisted doctrine, it leads to twisted behavior. People who leave the group are shunned. We talked about that a little bit. The group has a charismatic leader that's obeyed unquestionably. We've already talked about that. There are a lot of rules that you can't find in the Bible or easily justify from the Bible, or sometimes that are obscure from the Bible and applied stringently to today. I think is an interesting thing. Sometimes there can be this sort of dogmatic interpretation that can be a little bit of a red flag as well. Now don't get me wrong, like I think most Christians want to believe and obey the Bible. But when there's a lot of things added on to that, like think the Pharisees, it becomes a way of affirming we're right and you're wrong. And if that's playing in, and this is one of those things where you start to add up a lot of these, you start to say there's a lot of red flags. The group tries to control information. We're going to even talk about this in welcoming people to a cult. A lot of times, we're going to talk about how there's sometimes good and bad with this. Like as a Christian, we want to stay away from the world. We want to focus our mind on Christ. We don't want to, feed our minds a lot of bad worldly things. But a lot of these groups cut off almost all external inputs and create this own sort of bubble world with their own language, their own publications. Now, get it. A lot of groups have their publications, but you start to say, do people in this group, is it just a big echo chamber? That's, again, something to really look at. And is there any accountability? Well, why would you want to look at this topic, especially in a course on apologetics? One, I think it's interesting in a number of ways. Really, society in some ways takes that first definition of the cult and applies this to all of Christianity. And so we as a church want to differentiate ourselves from a cult. And we don't want to use those kind of tactics as a church. But society views religious movements as kind of a sociological phenomenon, and everything today is related to power and control. And so they would point at the church and say, you're just another one of those. And I think when we're authentically following Jesus, we're not to be a system of power control in that same way, at least. That doesn't mean there's no hierarchy or no rules or no accountability. Of course, there is. Everybody has that to some degree. But these things shouldn't be coercive. And Jesus, even God, if you think about how he set things up, is incredibly non coercive. He gives people choice and free will. And in fact, I think that's even some of the obscurity to how God works. He does speak honestly, but if we all were given this like complete picture of the reality of the universe like all at once, would there be real freedom to choose? It would feel much more coercive. And so there's this fine line, and that's what we're going to see, a fine line between what's good and healthy and helpful and what's like incredibly manipulative and controlling. So we're going to study to know that. Point number 2, many churches and ministry groups, and even some I've been a part of, some well-known Christian ones like Hillsong, have been called out for being a cult or having cult-like tendencies. And, I think this is really a shame. And again, part of this discussion will lead us to what's healthy, what's not, what's good, what's not. I think also, thirdly, cults ultimately take away from individuals. Really, when you look at what they do, they strip away money, power, individuality. Ultimately, cults take. They ultimately end up taking people's lives. They're ultimately incredibly destructive. And even people that finally escape from a cult sometimes feel so burned that they never want to experience true community again. And this is where I think the warning is important. We almost downplay the element of warning or speaking up against false doctrines or teachers, because we don't want to hurt people or we don't want to be the one calling names. But the reality is these things hurt people. And so to not warn them, it's really not loving. And so we need to know how these things work. We need to be aware, one, to protect ourselves, but also to protect our loved ones, our families. And I hope that by doing this course that people are able to be safe, because there are a lot of things out there. I'd say finally, like personally, I've seen how students, young adults, college students, how they've been taken in and how these things have taken everything from them. They become almost zombies as a part of these. And I've also seen how even well-meaning groups end up manipulating people, and that ultimately leaves a bad taste about Jesus in their mouths. And Jesus is supposed to be life-giving and loving. And so really this discussion of cults, and I really appreciate this about Glenn's article, ultimately becomes a discussion of how do I love God and love others better. And I think this is why it's important to engage the whole of who we are in this pursuit, including our mind, including being able to look at these things critically. How do we love God better? By the way, there's this revival thing happening in Asbury, and I'm already starting to see people saying, "Oh, this is bad. This is good about it." These kind of things, and then you get the people going, "Well, you shouldn't judge. I'd rather be gracious and receive what it has to offer than judge." And I think it's a horrible false dichotomy, and it's the same thing when judging different groups. We're not supposed to judge this critical looking down to write people off and dehumanize them. But we are supposed to have good judgment, wisdom in how we live our lives. And to do that, we need to look at these things holistically and say, is this good and healthy and helpful? And what is God doing here? And what is the good? And what is the bad? What can we learn? And what should we stay away from? What should we run from? And what should we even speak out against? So that's why we're doing all this. I hope you found this interesting. Sorry, there's nothing more interesting on the screen or, whatever going on at this stage. Production value, not super high here. But I want to invite you Wednesday nights at 7, and then we'll try to do streams if you want it and some recaps as well. We're going to talk about things such as how do people join a cult, the charismatic leader, isolation and control, what are these new and strange beliefs, and maybe even how to help people who are in a cult. So it should be a good set of discussions over the next maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks or so. God bless. Have a good day.